Right now, the whole world is at war, but not like you think. It's true. If you read the news, you're going to see that people are killing each other all over the world. But sadly, that's nothing new. So much so that I actually have a running debate with some of my students about whether the world has gotten worse over the last 200 years, or whether all the bad things happening just get better press than they once did. The war I'm talking about is taking place in the media, but it's rarely reported there. Just like people are waking up to the reality of social media, that we're the product and not the consumer, so too we need to wake up to the reality of the war that is being waged via new media and old, playing out in our schools, our universities, politics, places of worship. I'm talking about narrative warfare, the fight to tell the story. And in this fight, weapons are the words, your mind's the battlefield, the prize of victory and the price of defeat are the future. And truth is, this war isn't new either. Because the Torah is a story meant to be told by the whole world. Now, what exactly is meant by Torah and how it's a story that belongs to every human being is a long discussion. I bless us. We should have it at some point. But just for now, I want to begin at the beginning with that foundational notion that we're all created in the image of God. Because though eventually the story becomes about particular people, families, even nations, the beginning is very clear, and it belongs to us all. All of us have the infinite potential of the Creator within, regardless of gender, race, class, creed, or nation. Now, we're just before the point in the Jewish story when the nation-state is going to emerge as a driver for much of our coming drama. But the notion of the nation is much older than the 19th century European romantic nationalism that drives its present form. And I want to pause before we get into the next phase and think together about the battle that we as a people have been fighting since the day we were born. Now, it's worth it to note, in the context, that since we're in the holy month of Kislev and Hanukkah is coming up, that the defining phrase of how Am Yisrael relates to the story of our past is, and it's not actually just how we relate to the story of our past, it's actually how we live the story of our past in our presence. And that is, Bayamim hahem, bazman hazeh, in those days, at this time. It's a phrase that repeats itself particularly in Hanukkah, but you can find it in plenty of other places. And I'm sure we've spoken about the spiral of time, but let's just review. Remember, the ancient world had two notions of time. Cyclical, sunrise, sunset, right? The seasons go round and round. Nothing ever really changes. And linear. You're born, you live, you die. The power of the Hebrew calendar is based on combining these two motions of the cyclical and the linear into a spiral. And suddenly, each year is a cycle where we pass through the very same holy days. Hanukkah's coming around the wheel in a couple of weeks, and yet we're also moving forward along the path of time on a line from creation to redemption. Let it be soon, let it be now. And therefore, as we pass through the points of the year, Sukkot, Hanukkah, Purim, Pesach, we're also connecting to the relevance of what happened in those days at this time. And certain stories repeat themselves through our days and years, and down through history. Am Yisrael has been fighting the battle over our story since birth. And in truth, it was actually a prenatal struggle. Because as we saw recently in the weekly Torah reading, the ruckus which Rivka experienced in her womb led her to seek the insight of a prophet of God in order to know what exactly was going on inside her. And this is the answer she got. V'yomer Hashem la, shnei goyim bebitnech, u'shnei lumim mima'ayich yiparedu, u'le'um me'le'um ye'ematz, v'rav yavod tza'ir. And the Lord answered her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Not exactly the recipe for a happy home life or a peaceful future. Before they were even born, the brothers were in a struggle for supremacy. And once they came out into the light of the world, things only went downhill. Now, I hope you're familiar with the stories, because I'm not going to tell them. The sale of the birthright, the stolen blessing, threats of fratricide. The source of the conflict between Esau and Yaakov, who were born in that moment, is also too complex to clarify in a few brief words. But I will say this. Number one, everyone needs to think about the fact that no firstborn son of significance ever received his birthright in the Bible. Number two, whatever the conflict between the brothers was, the Bible is riddled with hints that in the end, the only resolution is somehow for the two to work together after all. We do say, Hakol, Kol Yaakov, V'hayadayim Yidei Esau, the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And our sages teach us that Esau's head is buried together with his brother there in the tomb of the patriarchs in the holy city of Hebron. But no matter what the resolution, everyone knows that there's no fight so bitter as a family fight. And remember, Yaakov and Esau aren't just brothers, they're twins. This wasn't narrative warfare in the way we understand it in our day, because Yaakov and Esau were actually in the story. They were fighting to determine who would be its main character. But our sages saw their conflict as the frame for a much larger struggle. The Gemara in Megillah says, Caesarea and Jerusalem. If someone says to you that both cities are destroyed, don't believe him. If someone says to you that they're both built and settled, don't believe him. If, however, he says to you that Caesarea is destroyed and Jerusalem is settled, or that Jerusalem is destroyed and Caesarea is settled, believe him. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak learned it from here. I quote, and the one people shall be mightier than the other. There's our verse. But it's not about Yaakov and Esau anymore, because in the rabbinic mind, Caesarea represents Rome. If you want to know the backstory on that, go back to season 1, episode 7. And the nation that they saw, Rome, as holding the context of the final exile. And the question of what a nation exactly is going to get its proper due in the coming episodes of the Jewish story. But for now, I'll just make this assertion. At its heart, a nation is a group of people united by a story. Not just an idea or a philosophy, or even a religion. A story, which has the power to embody itself in people and place. And since any story worth its name also has a narrative flow, it's going somewhere, and it can persist in time and shape the world in its image. And that's why, when two nations embody opposing stories, then conflict might appear inevitable. But before we can get to the opposing stories of the peoples that went on to embody this biblical prophecy, we have to meet one more character. You know, a simple reading of the Bible might seem to teach that Yaakov won the battle with his brother. And even though his descendants far, far into his future in the kingdom of Israel were ultimately exiled for their sins, that seemed to have nothing to do with a war of narratives. But we can see that the thread of narrative combat picked right back up in the post-biblical era. The first culture which Am Yisrael encountered after they were resettled in their land, we're talking now after the destruction of the first temple and the return to Zion, you put you in the 6th century before the Common Era. The first culture they encountered was the Greeks. And while it's true that at first the Jews stood as loyal subjects of the Persian Empire, resisting Alexander the Great's eastward march, once the Greek army was victorious, it was really love at first sight with their culture. And I'm not just talking about the fact that an entire generation of Kohanim, of priests, named their sons Alexander. I'm talking about the excitement of finally encountering another people dedicated to seeking the truth of reality, and a people with a well-developed set of tools to do so, philosophy. But, as is true with most instant romances, it didn't take long for trouble to begin. And I'm not going to recount the story of the Maccabean revolt, or the background of the holiday of Hanukkah. That's not our goal here, but you can always go back to season 1, episodes 4 through 6. For our purposes, it's enough to ask, when the whole world, or at least the whole Mediterranean and Near East, was going Greek, What was it at the core of the Jewish story that just wouldn't let it happen? Now, I say at the core, but don't forget that the Hanukkah story is a story of a civil war, of an inner battle for the soul of Am Yisrael, the story of how the core almost split. The Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah says that there was something quite strange amongst the decrees which the Greeks forced upon the Jews. Some seem obvious. They forbid them to do circumcision, to sanctify the moon, to study Torah, all the things that would wipe us out as a people. But there was one more. They forced them to write upon the horn of an ox, "You have no part in the God of Israel." That's a strange way to denigrate a people, by acknowledging their God and then saying he doesn't want you anymore. But you have to understand that the conflict between the Jews and the Greeks was well beyond political. It was actually about two competing stories. Does God relate to the world or not? Because we weren't just another Mediterranean people resisting conquest. The spirit of the Maccabees was the insistence that sovereignty over particular geography is a matter of theology. In other words, we must be a free people in our land in order to serve God and fulfill our role in creation. And that's because our story is that Am Yisrael is the embodiment of the promise that the finite and the infinite can connect, that there is a meeting place between heaven and earth, and that our task as a people is to hold that place in time, space, and behavior. By the way, whatever your theology, it bears a close look at our history before you make decisions on the truth of such a weighty assertion. Meanwhile, the Greeks were telling a very different story. First of all, political hegemony. You must bow to power. Second of all, cultural hegemony. Greek culture is real culture, and everyone can add their own angle, but there's nothing particularly unique or special or worth preserving about Am Yisrael. And furthermore, there is no meeting point between heaven and earth. In the eyes of the great philosopher Aristotle, who, reasonably speaking, carries Greek culture forward beyond their immediate embodiment in history, there is no framework of divine will that transcends nature. Nature's definitive. And the goal of knowing the world in the eyes of Aristotle is to reach the point where you understand it so well you would be amazed if anything were different than it is right now. While to Am Yisrael, the goal of knowing the world is knowing God. And since God is infinite, then that which is, that which we understand now, doesn't necessarily constrain that which could be. To Aristotle, the unity of God is expressed as what he calls perfection in form. God exists unchanging beyond the farthest stars. Aristotle's God didn't create the universe, and he certainly doesn't care about it. While Am Yisrael is telling a story about the unity of God, which is a unity of will. It was the divine will which brought existence into being out of nothing, and it's the same will which guides creation in every moment. Now, the Greeks saw a smooth continuum between physics and metaphysics, and therefore the idea of a God who acts like a character in a story, changing the natural order for the sake of some plan which exists outside of nature, is absurd. Now, we, Am Yisrael, also see a connection between physics and metaphysics, but only insofar as we know the same will which dictates the laws of nature dictates the laws of morality. And when push comes to shove, our history has proven time and again that we will always err on the side of anthropomorphism, even if it makes no sense that God is a character in our story, in order to maintain this unity of will which underlies creation, Torah, and history. And so, if you want to understand the bizarre nature and deep challenge of this Greek decree, you need to know they used the word chelek, part. They said you have no part in the God of Israel. And as the verse in Deuteronomy in Devarim says, Ki chelek Adonai amo Yaakov chevel nachlato, that Lord's portion is his people, Yaakov his own allotment. Forcing the Jews to write that they had no part in God was really forcing them to declare that God has no part in the world. That the core story of Am Yisrael as a nation which embodies the desire of the infinite to have a relationship with the finite is false. And by the way, There's a clear logical conclusion which flows from this Greek story. Get rid of the Jews, and the very idea that God has some portion, some connection to the world, disappears with them. And that's exactly what they tried to do. And sadly, then as now, many Jews agreed. The idea of a story which demands allegiance beyond that which the mind in all of its philosophical, scientific glory can know is burdensome, and to many downright ridiculous. And that's why the Hanukkah struggle was an inner struggle within the soul of Am Yisrael. Are we truly telling a different story than the rest of the world? Or should we just give up our tribal superstitions and be Greek-speaking Judeans? Now, most people know that Judah Maccabee and his brothers succeeded in driving out the Syrian Greeks, as the good song goes. But unless you've been listening to the Jewish story since early in Season 1, you may be unaware that while Am Yisrael won the battle, in a sense, we lost the war. The light of the Hanukkah miracle, which is really the ultimate symbol of the story of Am Yisrael, lives on. The light of the Hanukkah miracle, which is the ultimate symbol that the story of Am Yisrael lives on, the symbol that teaches that within every mundane thing lies the hidden light of creation, was lost quickly to the kingdom which Judah's descendants established. And the sages told the story of its last gasp like this, from the Gemara in Sota 59b, if you want to look it up. Our rabbis taught, when the kings of the Hasmonean house fought one another, those are the last descendants of the Maccabees, Hyrcanus was outside and Aristobulus within. Each day they used to let down denarii, gold coins in a basket, and haul up for them 2 animals for the continual offerings. Remember, all of them were priests, so even though they were fighting a civil war, it never occurred to them that their civil war should prevent the temple worship from going on. An old man there, continues the Gemara, who was learned in Greek wisdom, spoke with them in Greek, saying, morons, it doesn't actually say morons there, it said, as long as they carry on the temple service, they'll never surrender to you. And so when they asked him what to do, he told them. The next day they let down the gold coins in a basket, and the people outside put in a pig. And when they hauled the pig up and it reached halfway up the wall, it stuck its hooves into the wall of Jerusalem, and the entire land of Israel was shaken over a distance of 400 parsang. And concludes the Gemara, at that time they declared, cursed be a man who rears pigs, and cursed be a man who teaches his son Greek wisdom. It's interesting that the story of the failure of the Maccabean kingdom, of the house of the Hasmoneans, comes together with the definitive rabbinic statement that forbids the teaching of Greek wisdom, something which is going to be the source of much struggle down the line. I can't go into the depth of all the arguments around what exactly this Greek wisdom, which brings curse upon a person, is. But I can say that with many of the sages throughout the ages taking their rightful place as masters of philosophy, it appears that the standard definition of Greek wisdom as philosophy doesn't really fit. But fortunately, the story makes it exactly clear where the problem lies. What did this old man tell them to do? He said, you fools, so long as you're inside the same story, that there is this place that you're serving which connects heaven and earth, that that's the essence of who you are, and you're just struggling about who will be the main character, well then, nobody has the upper hand. You're both priests. Step out of the story, he told them. Be a little bit more realistic. Put a pig in the basket, stop the service, and then, if you want, you can start it again when you're in charge. What's the essence of Greek wisdom? The essence of Greek wisdom is what we call dat chitzoni. It's taking yourself outside of the story. Not just that, it's the belief that the story is holding you back. And as the old man said, just step out of your story, and all you desire can be yours. So we're in this lightning review of all of Jewish history, but don't take your eyes off the prize. Then and now, the primary battle which we're fighting is narrative warfare. And even though sometimes it will embody itself in the physical, it's not the main point. Now, that might not appear to be the case when you look at the advent of Rome on the scene. Because in the rabbinic mind, the pig which the Hasmoneans hauled up in Jerusalem in the last story I told was actually Rome, who indeed were invited into the land of Israel to resolve the civil war between the two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And the next 200 years in the land of Israel were rocked by war. In the land of Israel. But by the end of the first century before the Common Era, the rest of the Mediterranean had been beaten into submission and was more than happy to enjoy the stability of what historians call the Pax Romana. Everyone except the Jews. We fought not one, not two, but 3 wars in a futile attempt to throw off the Roman yoke and live an independent national life. Remember that spirit of the Maccabees. Sovereignty over particular geography is a question of theology. We must be a free people in our land in order to serve God by uniting heaven and earth. And because of that attitude, the Judeans became the indigestible element of the Roman Empire, a thorn in their eastern flank which drained blood and treasure like no other. Now, the Romans, of course, were the ultimate embodiment of what we call Greco-Roman culture, and many of the narrative elements of our struggle with Greece carried over, but they added an important piece: fake news. All you need to do is compare the descriptions of the sages about Jewish suffering in these wars to that of the Roman historian Cassius Dio, and no matter which account you think is true, you'll agree they can't both be right. In the Yerushalmi, the Gemara composed here in the land of Israel, it says the Romans went on killing Jews until a horse was sunk in blood up to its nose, and the blood was turning over huge boulders until it flowed 40 Roman miles into the sea. They said that the brains of 300 children were found on one rock. That's how the rabbis saw it. And Cassius Dio says, meanwhile the Jews would cook the flesh of their enemies, make belts for themselves of their entrails, anoint themselves with their blood, and wear their skins for clothing. Many they sawed in two, from the head downwards. For this reason, he says, no Jew may set foot in Cyprus, but even if one of them is driven upon the island by force of the wind, he's put to death. Wow. But the Romans didn't stop at defamation. The goal of their war, narrative and conventional, was annihilation. Therefore, after the crushing third defeat of the Judeans, the emperor declared that Judea no longer existed. On every map of the Roman world, which meant at that point most maps in existence, the land of Israel would henceforth be known as Palestina. He wiped us off the map. And this is a piece of fake news with which we are still struggling today. Because if you're a Jew, you're from Judea. But if Judea doesn't exist anymore, and it's Palestina, well, who comes from there? And, we're not just struggling. In many ways, this move defines us. The Romans created a reality. That's what fake news is. The Jews were the indigestible element in their empire, too stubborn to accept the peace they offered in return for bowing to power. And when Christianity conquered Rome, we went from being the indigestible element of empire to the obstinate rejectors of salvation. Now, I'm not going to review the history of the narrative struggle with Christianity. Hopefully you've heard it from me already. Just remember that the sages identified our verse. 2 nations are in your womb, 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. One shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Not only as referring to Yaakov and Esau, or even only to Rome and Judea, but also as referring to Christianity and Judaism. This is the phase that I've been calling the hermeneutic battle. Who can win the contest of biblical interpretation and thereby tell a story of the past that will get us to that redeemed future of which we dream? And it's critical to note that the hermeneutic struggle is actually different than anything we've spoken of right now. Because no matter what divides us from Christianity, we're still united by the text. We're still seeking to unite heaven and earth, and we believe that such a thing is not only possible, but it is our purpose. But I'm taking this interlude just before the modern era, because a new and devastating round of narrative warfare is about to erupt. The hallmark of modernity is the belief in reason. The light of reason will drive away the shadows of superstition and free us from the bonds of the past. That's right, reason and freedom go hand in hand, because when we use reason, it can free us from the stories that keep us in chains to our ignorance. Tradition is ignorance. Progress is freedom. And so this round of the narrative warfare actually skips back to its Greco-Roman roots. By the way, just as the disciples of reason from Renaissance to the Enlightenment did in their learning. They were neoclassicists. They believed it was the pre-Christian Greco-Roman culture which offered the best that Europe had to access. And their battle cry was no longer the hermeneutic struggle, this story is about us, this story is about us. Their battle cry was, there is no story. And lo and behold, the Jews suddenly became an enemy of reason itself. The modern era pitted science against religion, reason against story, and it equated freedom with certainty. But I have news for any of you that may still be stuck back in that round of the battle. The human mind is phenomenal. I'm a big fan. But creation is much larger than we can even imagine, much less conceptualize. So really what the worshippers of reason did in modernity was reduce existence to proportions which the human mind could grasp, and then turn around and can claim that that was all there was. The moderns drove out superstition, they said, but really what they did was they took all mystery out of existence. And the narrative war went back to the Greek versus Jew model of the light of reason versus the darkness of superstition. But really what it was about whether you're going to shrink the world to fit your size or whether you're willing to live in the mystery. But there's good news. We're not in the modern era anymore, Toto. The light of reason was shown to have some deep shadows and limitations when the gates of Auschwitz were opened and when the atom bomb exploded over Hiroshima. And how exactly does the light of reason explain the amazing plot twist in the Jewish story which has brought us back to our land more or less in the same era? And now, surrounded by battles, narrative and conventional. Because we live in the postmodern era. And here in the postmodern era, certainty has been abandoned by science. And narrative has replaced all of the scientific notions of truth. And it's no surprise to me that we're finally fighting the narrative battle on all fronts. So I'll just finish by saying this little pause and review. We're still in the hermeneutic battle about who received the birthright from Abraham Avinu, from our father Abraham. The three revealed religions that look back to him as the source are struggling. And the question amongst them is whether the story has to lead to supremacy of one or whether there's another way. I'm happy to say it seems to me that Christianity has done a lot to evolve. Islam sadly appears still stuck in the Middle Ages. Yisrael? I'm working on it. And now we're also fighting the narrative war in the world of fake news. What's actually happening in this little chunk of real estate. And to that, all I can say is, come and see for yourself. Come home, people, if it's your home. If not, come visit. And bring back the word. There's nothing like seeing it for yourself. And ultimately, we're struggling to assert that there is a story at all. Not a narrow, self-serving tale where we get to interpret everything as either victim or oppressor. But a story so big that we don't tell it, it tells us. And so, to close where we began, this story is ultimately about all of us being created in the image of God. You know, as our master and teacher, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, teaches, the uniqueness of Am Yisrael lies in the fact that God, in His infinite grace, told us that we were created in the image of God. He put the story of the infinite potential of humanity in our hands in order that it not be lost, in order that we pass it on. And that is surely a story which the whole world can tell. I want to thank a few people. I want to thank all the people that give their hard-earned money in order to help keep this material free and widely distributed. I want to invite you to join them right now. In the lead up to Hanukkah, I'm looking for 36 new patrons. 36 is the number of the Hanukkah candles. And all you need to do is go to www.patreon.com. You can find my M Foyer page for a little bit of per podcast support. You can also check out the site at Rav Mike Foyer at Facebook, or you can send me an email, ravmikefoyer@gmail.com. I want to thank the Land of Israel Network for building such a wonderful platform to reach so many good people. I want to thank the Pardes Institute, pardes.org.il, for giving me the opportunity to touch so many hearts and minds of the good Jews out there. I want to thank Suam Yaakov, because it's my home, and I want to thank you for listening. I'm Rav Mike Foyer, and this is The Jewish Story.